Hello Reddit, I'm Ānanda Josephson, and this is the first in a series of lectures, I hope there'll be 6 of them, about the concept of religion. I'm going to lecture for a little bit, and then if you have comments or questions, you shouldn't post them here on YouTube, but should post them back on the original Reddit thread, which I've uploaded under the name Darkness Visible 7, which is the name I use on Reddit. Okay, so let's get started, and let's talk a little bit about the concept of religion. What I'm going to talk about today in particular, I think of as kind of the hook, the start of the conversation. And I'm also going to talk about 2 different ways that the concept of religion functions in European and American culture and society today. So religion is generally assumed to be a universal aspect of human experience found in all cultures. It is generally believed that as long as there have been people, there have been religion, the individual atheist or non-believer notwithstanding. This assumption about the universality of religion permeates our culture. We can find it all over the modern academy. The most influential philosophers, people like Kant and Heidegger and Rorty, the most influential sociologists like Durkheim, Weber, Bourdieu, and Habermas, of the last 200 years, they all seem to have largely taken religion for granted as a universal aspect of human experience. But more recently, a diverse array of scholars, from Talal Asad and Jacques Derrida to Jonathan Z. Smith and Tomoko Masazawa, have called into question the very field of religious studies by demonstrating that religion is not actually a universal entity, but instead is a culturally specific category that took shape among Christian-influenced Euro-American intellectuals and missionaries. In this Reddit course, I will be talking about the history of the concept of religion, and I'm going to be talking about debates around its universality. In effect, I'll be discussing the construction of religion as a modern concept and discussing everything that this entails. The question is, what is religion? And is it really a universal aspect of human experience? What is religion? If an alien civilization suddenly made contact with us, how would we know what part of the alien's life was religion? It might sound easy, but this turns out to be a fabulously difficult question. When European explorers first came to the New World, for example, they tried to figure out if the indigenous people had religion, and if so, what their religion might be. Today, we tend to think of it as a foregone conclusion that there was something called Native American religion. But that is not what Columbus and his contemporaries thought. For example, according to Richard Eden, who wrote one of the first English language accounts of the discovery of the Americas, he said that when Columbus arrived, quote, the inhabitants went naked, without shame, religion, or knowledge of God, end quote. Now, skipping over the part about nakedness, which is a European preoccupation, what we can see in there is that he is in effect denying that the native peoples of the Americas have a religion, and he's equating the idea of religion with a knowledge of God. Let me give you another example from my book, The Invention of Religion in Japan. In 1853, when American warships showed up off the coast of Japan, they forced the Japanese to sign a set of trade treaties guaranteeing a number of basic human rights, one of which was freedom of religion. When Japanese translators encountered this word religion, they had no idea what it meant. There was no indigenous cultural category that corresponded to the Euro-American religion, nor was it clear to them what indigenous traditions might fit under the heading religion. They were stuck in a bind, and it took them more than 20 years to formulate a systematic translation and vocabulary for the Euro-American religion, and it took them longer to debate what fit into the category. What I want to suggest that these examples show is that religion is far from a given, and that defining religion is a pretty fundamental problematic. Where might we go for a definition? Well, you might go to dictionaries. I argue that there are two broad classes of definitions in place in contemporary dictionaries. In point of fact, if you take dictionaries seriously, the meaning of the word religion has been undergoing a major shift over the span of the last 30 years. That narrow window, just 30 years. Many dictionaries written in this period in English, French, Italian, and German show the same pattern. Older editions of these works, such as Le Petit Larousse, define religion as the worship of God, while more recent versions of these dictionaries substitute another word for God. Usually it's something very vague, like supernatural or the sacred. This shift from thinking that every culture worships God to thinking that every culture has something around the supernatural or around the sacred is a pretty major one. And it comes from the recognition that not all cultures worship God. But I think of these as two different, distinct and competing definitions of religion. One I call the theocentric, and the other I call the hyrocentric definition of religion. One of the ways that you might formulate that definition is what I call the theocentric concept of religion. I write about this in my book in the introduction. You can find more details there. But for our purposes, this theocentric definition is best exemplified in the famous French Encyclopédie of the French Enlightenment, which stated that, quote, "The foundation of all religion is that there is a God who has dealings with his creatures and who requires them to worship him," end quote. Okay, people say that this book began the secular study of religion, but this definition is richly, deeply, and profoundly theological. The foundation of all religion is that there is a God. God is behind all the religions of the world. And this definition, this theocentric definition, has lasted until the present. We don't have to go back to Diderot to find examples of it. The German scholar Ernst Troeltsch described religion as, quote, "flowing and alive, ever drawing on God through direct contact with him." So built into this definition of religion is an idea and a very explicit monotheism, which understands religion to be identical to the worship of God. But for that exact reason, this definition is deeply and fundamentally flawed, and most scholars today won't grant it. Why? Because it's very Christian. Most cultures don't think that they worship God. In fact, while disguised in the language of tolerance, this definition is condescending and distorting because it assimilates very different entities, like the Confucian heaven and the historical Buddha, under the banner of a Christian God. Buddhists don't think that Buddha is just another name for God. It's nice to suggest that we do, but we don't. Confucians don't think that heaven is the same thing as God. Taoists don't think that the Tao is the same thing as God. Most cultures don't believe in God. If they did, they would be Abrahamic religions, right? So basically, according to this view, a monotheistic God, even if obscured or misunderstood, is at the very core of religion. The definition doesn't work, though. If you tried to find where in Japanese culture, for example, people worship God, you'll find some Christians, basically, but you won't find any other religions. Christianity is only able to see itself with this definition, or to see itself in Islam and Judaism, basically. And if you learn one thing from this set of lectures, hopefully you'll get the sense that not all cultures believe in God. Not all cultures, not all religions are focused around the worship of a monotheistic deity. So if that's not the definition of religion that we want to use or that scholars use, what are the other possibilities? The other one I call the Hyrocentric definition of religion. And it's best summed up in the current edition of Larousse as, quote, an established set of beliefs and tenets defining the relationship between man and the sacred, end quote. This definition suggests that what religion is about is the sacred and that it is organized in a set of propositions. This definition, too, is flawed. It's better than the other one. It's a lot better. But the term sacred is incredibly fuzzy. Everybody thinks that they know what the sacred is, and everybody thinks that they're able to identify what in their own life or in someone else's life is the sacred. But it's actually really hard because the definition is so broad and so vague. Our term, sacred, for example, connects etymologically to a Roman legal category, the homo sacer, the sacred man. And the sacred man was someone who was set apart from the community. To designate someone as sacred in the Roman legal context meant that they no longer had a place in the community. And that didn't mean that they were like holy. What it meant is that you could kill them without it being murder. So the homo sacer is a man who you can kill because he is no longer part of the community. He's like a bandit or a vagabond. So in that culture, they're using the word sacred, sacer, but they don't mean anything like the fuzzy things that we try and fit into the category sacred. Anyway, the sacred is a better definition than the Hyrocentric is a better definition of religion than the Theocentric one, but it's deeply problematic. And the real heart of its problem is because, as I'll argue, the sacred is merely the shadow of God. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The sacred is merely what appears when someone has excised the word God from the definition. If you just take your dictionary and you remove the word God and you want to plug in something vaguer, but that basically covers the same things, you tend to put in words like the sacred or the transcendent. They're bad synonyms, vague synonyms for God, and they just represent the present absence, the haunting shadow of the Judeo-Christian deity. We'll argue about that later perhaps, but for the moment, let's say that the concept, the Hyrocentric definition of religion, was not born in the last 30 years, but represents the culmination of 200 years of sedimentation. It represents what we could call a partial de-Christianization of the category religion, resulting from the importation of non-Western cultural systems into the category. But I'm going to argue that instead of buttressing the category religion, it actually makes it impossible to determine if something is a religion or not. The other problem is that our list of religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, what have you, didn't come from looking for the sacred in different people's cultures. If you tried to do that, you would end up being unable to locate it or fix it on organized systems like religion. You probably also wouldn't find it in a bunch of places. Now, our version of the list, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, came from the Theocentric definition. Basically, people wandered around Japan and tried to figure out what looked like Christianity. And then they argued about how it fit, and they called it a religion if they found something that did so. At root, this issue is a problem common to analytic philosophy. It is the issue of making intention and extension, bringing intention and extension into correspondence. As Gottlob Frege called it, this is the issue of Sinn and Bedeutung. We might translate that as sense or meaning and reference. In other words, you want your definition to capture the things you're talking about. If you're defining religion, you want to have, a system of beliefs and practices relevant to the sacred, capture your list of religions, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Confucianism, or be able to pick out that part of the world as a referent that the definition should embody. Might sound easy, but as I'm going to argue, it's maddeningly difficult. In fact, the entire history of the discipline of religious studies, since it was first formulated by Friedrich Max Müller in the 19th century, has been grappling with this problem of how do you define religion. To explain that to you, we're going to have to go quite a bit back into the past, and the next talk I'm going to be giving you an etymology, a more deep etymology of the term religio, from which most modern terms for religion descend. So if you have comments about this, leave them on Reddit, not YouTube. I will try and comment on Reddit and give you feedback, and then in about a week, or more likely 2, I'll post another video or another lecture. We can keep the conversation going. I'm going to give you a history of the way that people have tried to conceptualize religion, and in doing so, I think hopefully destabilize or reformulate your own understandings of religion as well. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Over and out.